A near disaster for Geraint Thomas. Nothing has changed as it now stands on the general classification, but that was heart in the mouth moment, Robbie, wasn't it?
Yeah, it really was. For everybody watching, for G himself, I'm sure his team were having kittens behind when that happened. It's just one of those moments, and it really is a lack of concentration, a fatigue moment where Geraint looked over his shoulder one way, and when you do that, you tend to sort of just stray off your line. You see him here on the right-hand side, just over the pedestrian crossing, looks over his left shoulder, looks back to the front, but at the same time, Antonio Tiberi is following the wheel of Romain Bardet back to the right-hand side. You see it much better illustrated from the front. So as Bardet, he looks over and goes across. G looks over one side, looks over his other shoulder. As the rider in front of him goes back the other direction, he just clips the wheel and comes off. Simple as that.
It still looks really clumsy almost, Dan, and he's crashing by trying to avoid a crash, really, isn't he?
It looks clumsy. It happens so easily.
Yeah.
There was a stage of the Tour de France a few years ago where Bob Jungels switched across the road, I think it was. I can't remember who he took down now. That was quite nasty, at higher speed. But there's nothing you can do. Like,
Gita, I think. Gita.
Yeah, Gita. Was it Gita? Anyway, on this occasion, you know, it looks clumsy, as you said, but it can happen just in an instant, because if you do look over and all of a sudden your momentum's slightly left and the person across in front of you is sweeping across to the right. It was Aronson first went to the right, Bardet just followed, Tiberi followed him. So nobody's fault. You know, those things just happen on the way into the finish line when no one's really attacking anymore. It just so happened that swing to the right coincided with a lack of concentration from G looking forward as his body weight was going to the left. And when you've got that front wheel of yours overlapping with the rear wheel of somebody else's, that rear wheel doesn't move. You know, your front does. So as soon as you hit the rear wheel, it just skews your handlebars and you've just got no way of staying balanced. So you hit the floor. But as Nathan pointed out off camera, it was quite a slow-speed crash, so in some ways he was even more lucky not to break a bone, because when you slap the floor like that at slow speed, you tend to have the most chance of doing serious damage.
Yeah, they're often the worst, aren't they? We don't yet know what the physical damage is, Nathan, but the damage in the general classification could have been an awful lot worse for Geraint Thomas. He's currently sitting third. Obviously, the race continues, but they decided to sit up and allow him to get back on again, didn't they?
Yeah, it was very nice to see.
Yeah.
It was very nice to see all the GC leaders just looking at each other, and also Pogacar, I think, played a big role, just going to the front saying, we're waiting for G to come back. And I think the situation there, if it were still a climb coming up, or if it were to happen, like if Bardet would have attacked, for example, and G would have crashed, then the situation is completely different. Now everybody saw him crashing. There was no attacks going on, so it was not more than normal that the peloton or the small group, the favourites, waited for him.
So explain why this happens then. I'll go to you, Dan, on this one, because for anyone who is new to cycling, this is a very peculiar element of the sport that people struggle to get their heads around, and often it involves the race leader. So when the Maglia Rosa, in this case, crashes and the attack isn't quite on, often people will sit up and essentially neutralise out of respect for the leader's jersey. This was slightly different, but why does it happen anyway?
I guess there's always been these, I'm not sure what the politically correct term is for gentlemen's agreements that you get between...
Unwritten rules, I guess.
Unwritten rules between the riders of... But, you know, it can be so different in so many different places, because like Nathan said, had that been with 3Ks to go on a summit finish, they're probably not going to wait. And I guess if you're on the other side of the fence, you could sort of say, well, it was kind of his own fault. You know, he wasn't looking in front of him as this thing happened. You know, that would be a real harsh thing to say, and if he had lost time, I would see it as being really harsh. I'm in agreement with Nathan. I'm glad to see that they did wait. But had they not, you could sort of say, well, it's part of racing. You know, staying upright is part of racing. Even not puncturing is part of racing in terms of the tyre choice you make and the line you take on corners, etc. But yeah, it's always been a bit like this, where, like I said, particularly with the leader's jersey, but I think anyone up there on GC, you don't want to see somebody after all the hard work of the last 3 weeks lose it because of such a silly and stupid crash. And, you know, that could have been a minute. You know, had O'Connor and Tiberi thought, oh, we'll take advantage of this, drive it towards the line, it certainly could have been at least half a minute anyway. But yeah, nice to see that sort of thing still going on.
Were you surprised, though, Robbie, to see it? I was slightly surprised, and I was waiting initially. My gut was to see is Tymon Arensman, his teammate, going to set up and help him get back on again.
I thought you were going to say attack. You get a podium here.
No, I was expecting to see him sitting up and waiting. I wasn't expecting the whole group of them to sit up and wait. Were you?
I was. To be honest, yes, in that situation, like Nathan explained, because they weren't racing for a summit finish, the attacks weren't flying left, right and centre. And really it happened because nothing was happening. Like there was no reason for G really to be looking over his shoulder. Pogacar was right there and Danny Martinez was right there. So what was he actually looking at? It's because nothing was sort of happening. He thought, oh, I'll just look around. But golden rule, watch where you're going, not where you've been.
Question then, Nathan, would this have been different if the battle between the top three were tighter? Because Tadej Pogacar can easily, and Rafa Majka, the two of them were chatting there, they can easily say, yeah, we will sit up and wait for Geraint Thomas because it makes absolutely no difference to us. If that battle at the front were tighter, do you think that might have changed the situation? And also, would we have seen the exact same thing at the Tour de France, where the pressure and the stakes are much higher?
I think the battle actually is quite tight because Ben O'Connor is not so far behind G right now, and also Danny Martinez is not so far in front. So, in my opinion, the battle is still quite tight. But Geraint Thomas is of course a very respected rider in the bunch, and this was not a GC stage. There were a few small attacks, but nothing significant. But in a proper GC stage, I think the circumstances might be a little bit different. Like tomorrow is really their last chance. If something like this happens tomorrow, I'm not quite sure what Ben O'Connor in that example is going to do, because Danny Martinez doesn't have anything to gain. He's already in front, but all the guys behind, they have something to win. Ben O'Connor can finish on the podium of a Grand Tour.
And if they were to do that, you can't really blame them either, because it is a race. It's one of those vagaries, I guess, and it's decided in a split second on the road between, as you say, supposed gentlemen, essentially.
I guess if you look at it in black and white, you couldn't blame them, but they would have been in for some backlash, I think, on social media, etc. Even though, as you rightly point out, that could well be deemed just racing. Like I said before, just staying upright. Sorry, Nathan.
You also see the first reaction from Ben O'Connor when the crash happens is he gets out of the saddle and he accelerates. That's a normal reaction, but he doesn't accelerate to attack. I think it's just to get back to the wheel. But maybe there might be a small thought like, oh, this is the guy who's third in GC. I need to pass him before Rome, otherwise I don't finish on the podium.
This is where I think if Tiberi had moved at the same time, then the attack might have been on, and where the influence of Tadej Pogacar in particular and Rafa Majka both being there dominating the pace of the group, that's what decides it. But it's these vagaries and these grey areas, these nuances within professional cycling that I think make it absolutely fascinating. And it means it's constantly open to interpretation, which keeps us, I guess, in a bit of a job, because there's always plenty to talk about.